gunned down by the security forces during a peaceful demonstration a week ago. Amongst the gathering, Ilang's grandfather, himself a former army general.
In my day, the army would protect our students. Suddenly they turn against them. I don't understand this country.
Ilang was one of 6 university students killed when the authorities opened fire after a massive anti-government demonstration spilled onto the street. He's remembered as a quiet, ambitious young man who was studying to become an architect, concerned about his country's future, but opposed to violent protest.
We must continue the struggle to ensure that this country sees political reform. Unless that happens, Ilang will have died in vain.
At the university in which Ilang died, fellow and former students have been paying tribute. Among them, activist Ahmad Sartanto and his father Ali. Sartanto Sr. studied here in the mid-60s and campaigned in favor of Suharto coming to power. In contrast, his son has been agitating for Suharto's removal. Both now agree he let them down.
The message to my son is just make reformation, a good reformation. So, because we have to help the poor people and we have to help all the Indonesian nation. You know.
A lot of students right now struggle and following their father's path. So I'm just one out of 1,000. So yeah, it will continue. It will.
The hope is that other innocent people will not have to give their lives. Ilang Mulia's only crime in the eyes of the authorities was to call for change. With burial plots being prepared for other victims of the struggle, his family's greatest hope is that Ilang's call for political reform will soon be answered. David Willis, BBC News, Jakarta.
Now the rest of the news. President Clinton...
Of the parliament, everything I want to say, you know. I have told the members of the parliament that now we have to be very fast in solving the most urgent problem. I think, yes.
Is this the last chance for a peaceful change?
I think so, especially the day after tomorrow. We will see huge of mass in different cities.
By now, the entrance to Parliament was packed with hundreds of students, the real power behind the reform movement. There were tense moments as soldiers surrounded the chanting crowds, but the event was peaceful as the students had hoped. They've achieved all this without using links with political parties, but they, like other reform groups, want to use existing political institutions to end the crisis.
It's all mildly surreal, very correct, and very constitutional. The assembly that meets every 5 years to rubber stamp the re-election of President Suharto and is almost entirely dominated by his own nominees, is being asked to come together again to agree to his removal and with the approval of the army. If this peaceful tactic actually works, then Suharto will have been removed by an unlikely coalition, dominated by students with no real leaders, but with a network right across the country.
Students we met insisted this was a moral campaign, not a political campaign. They weren't out to endorse a particular party or candidate. They wanted to prepare the country by educating ordinary people. It was agreed that the economic crisis made it easier to get the message across. And by the end of the afternoon, it seemed that this somewhat vague, idealistic campaign might actually have succeeded. After a day of parliamentary pressure, the Speaker of the House, Hamoko, who is also spokesman for Suharto's party, appeared on local television and made his bombshell announcement: Suharto should go. But he didn't. The reformers' hopes fell apart with the press conference given by General Wiranto, who'd always been seen as sympathetic to the students. He talked of dialogue only last Friday. Now he warned ominously about the demonstrations planned for Wednesday.
There's a part of society that is trying to re-incite the people as much as possible for May the 20th.
Behind him at the press conference was General Prabowo, head of Special Forces and Suharto's son-in-law. The Jakarta rumour mill insists he's the real hardliner, and could have won out in any intermilitary feuding tonight. All of which is bad news for the students and other reform groups planning their massive demonstrations for Wednesday. At the University of Indonesia tonight, they insisted they'd go ahead, the fight goes on.
We will not surrender, we will not stop our demonstration, our movement until Suharto step down. We think so.
Do you think there'll be confrontation now, more confrontation between the army and the students? And others in the university?
Of course. Again, it is the same old story. We are preparing ourselves to face them and in more repressive form, more repressive actions from the military.
So at the end of a remarkable day, the prospects for a peaceful solution are suddenly very remote.
That was Robin Denzelo in Jakarta. Here in the studio in London, John Taylor, who is an expert on Indonesia from South Bank University and who came back from Jakarta yesterday. Ahmad Banerji from Foreign and Colonial, which is a big investor in the area, and Liong, who's a member of the Indonesian opposition based here in London. Liam, is it worth going on if the army is going to crack down in the way that General Wiranto seems to suggest they will do?
I think your report doesn't suggest that he's going to have a crackdown. On the contrary, what I read from the events today is different. It started with all these events in front of the parliament. You saw different strands of the, let's say, opposition. One is the strand represented by former generals and ex-ministers and so who spoke. Later on, the second person who came was Rais, who represents the urban Muslims. And the third, the most radical ones, were the students. And in fact, if you look properly at your film, the students were taken to the parliament by the military, escorted in fact by the military with buses. So there is in fact a very good relationship growing between the military.
But in that case, what do you make of that statement from Wiranto later?
Wiranto did not say that he's going to have a crackdown. He's only trying to say, look, please be careful. We don't like this kind of things, because if looting and rioting starts again, then of course then it can happen like what we've seen in the last 3 days.
But he did appear to warn against these big demonstrations on Wednesday.
The students have been demonstrating, and the pro-democracy movement have been demonstrating for weeks and weeks, very, very orderly. And only because the military shot 6 students, the whole thing, rioting and looting, started. So in fact what happened in those 3 events today, what was covered by your correspondent, the chief lackey of Suharto, he's also the Speaker of Parliament, Harmoko, announced that it's better for the unity of the country that Suharto should step down. This is very tricky. This is the man who has been defending and has been the spokesperson for Suharto for many, many years. Why is he talking like that? Because he's trying to find a way out, a face-saving device. If maybe to say a Pinochet solution.
So you think the army may not in fact be toughening up, it may be trying to find a way for Suharto to go?
Exactly. So in fact, what he was announcing in that press conference, Wiranto, is they're going to have a reform council, the military, and they're trying to talk with the students about it. So in fact, it's the other way around. But of course, I have to be careful to say this, because at the same time, we saw in the film a general called Prabowo, the son-in-law of Suharto, a hardliner. And I've heard from several sources today that tomorrow already, not even the 20th, but tomorrow, the 19th, students are going on the streets. Even other groups in the society are going on the streets. And Prabowo is planning to have a crackdown at them.
John Taylor, what do you make of this? It is at best ambiguous what the army is up to.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what Liem says, because I would corroborate what he says about, but not just in relation to Jakarta, because I was in Bandung and Surabaya, Yogyakarta. For example, in Bandung, you know, you had a demonstration of about 100,000 people, and those were across the whole social spectrum. There was not very much violence, except at the end with a bit of stone throwing, very well organised, clear articulated reforming demands.
I'm sure that's the case, but what about this point about the role the army is playing? Because Wiranto did say that in his view the president should continue and carry out a programme of reform. Now you can't have him continue in doing that and have him out.
I think that there's clear differences within the armed forces. I mean, you know, if you go to these cities and you actually see military barracks, and across those barracks there is a slogan which says, "We are in favour of reforms," and you have other sections of the military who agree with that, then it's as Liem says, that is a general picture. But on the other hand, you have a terribly dangerous situation where somebody like Prabowo, with his base within the armed forces, can still stand up and defend Suharto's position. So I think you have
But if
real
Prabowo
differences
were
within the
to
military.
mount something, as Liem was suggesting, tomorrow, if the army were dragged in behind it, do you think the armed forces would be prepared to go out onto the streets and kill those students who've been protesting?
No, they're seriously divided, and Prabowo is in a minority position. But nonetheless, it's still very, very dangerous.
I wonder in that case, Ahmad Banerji, if you have paralysis, the economy is in chaos, how one gets the president to go?
I'm not sure how that can be managed, but I would say that from the view of external investors, it's unlikely that people will put any money to work in the economy. And the Indonesian economy is very sensitive.
I should say, by the way, that we've just had that the World Bank, which was due to have a meeting tomorrow to decide on further loans for Indonesia, hasn't cancelled that meeting, or postponed it at any rate, which rather backs up what you're saying.
I think that underlines the point, because the problem is that investors will not invest unless there's confidence in continuity and stability. And whatever your political view, at this moment in time, if Suharto holds on, the jury would be out and new investment would not crystallize for quite a long time. And what the World Bank's done, what other banks have done, and what investors are doing at this point in time is sitting on their hands waiting for stability to appear. So the question is, how can we get this stability? While that money is not there, then the price of things like cooking oil and rice keep going up, and that fuels the instability further. So they're into a vicious circle, a spiral. And I'm not politician enough to be able to tell you how the transition will occur, but there's a strong feeling in the investment community that a transition will occur.
Well, see, it's all very well for the World Bank postponing meetings now, but isn't it really the World Bank and the IMF who got us into this mess in the first place?
I agree with that.
Well, I'm not sure I do.
I mean, only in the sense that you might say, you know, that the IMF program, whilst it might be appropriate for Latin American states, is not particularly appropriate for Indonesia. You could make that kind of argument. But on the other hand, you could also say that if there hadn't been that program, then you wouldn't have had this reaction which you had in Indonesia. It's a kind of double-edged thing. But
well, it's a kind of odd argument to say that the world financial community should implement completely inappropriate programs in order to spark riots so that nasty dictators can be overthrown.
I'm not sure that's entirely justified at all. Look, first of all, it was very large private sector borrowing that got this, the economy into trouble in the first place. What happened simply was that they were unable to meet their debt obligations. There was a run on the currency. The currency is now less than a quarter of what it was worth at this time last year. So there's been a collapse. So the country can't then afford the imports that are essential.
But
now the IMF came in.
What do you make of the
IMF's
IMF's role? Because
I think the IMF made the things much worse. They did 3 so-called rescue operations. From the beginning, it was a mess. They started by closing, I think, 12 banks, and so they should have closed 200 banks. So by closing 12 banks, they exacerbated the problem.
That I'd agree.
And then so on and so on and so on. So in fact, what you were just saying, and so they've become part of the problem, not part of the solution.
No, I don't agree with you there, because you're right, they should have closed 200 banks, but do you really think this regime would have allowed it? I mean, the compromise was the 12. The 200 would have created a backlash. Now,
all right, but if we need stability now, the next big question is the opposition fragmented, as it appears to be, capable of creating a new regime, John Taylor?
Well, I think that's almost an impossible question to answer, really. I think that you see, you know, when you see these kind of actions, you see that there are representations from different groups. So as I say, you know, a demonstration in a city like, for example, Yogyakarta starts in a mosque and it's joined by other political groupings, and they can work on that level. So if you were to go to somewhere like Gajah Mada University, you might see, you know, Reformasi, and you get about 10 points of what the program should be, but they remain at a very general level, and they're subject to very different interpretations by these groups. So it's a question of whether that can become
more than that to form.
I mean, for me, fragmentation is strength, not weakness, because in any democracy, you have different political parties. We don't even have political parties. So the very first step to go into what he is saying about stability is indeed to form political parties in this post-Suharto
Well, just on that, Ahmad Banerji, putting your best banker's face on for a moment, what would you need to see in Indonesia before you would be prepared to consider putting so much as 1 rupiah into it?
Well, a regime that had the confidence of the people, and so that the riots disappeared. And I would expect the IMF and multilateral organizations to go easy on Indonesia in that transition, probably led by the United States and Europe, and then private investment would flow.
It's very symbolic that the IMF, in fact, with the chartered plane, left Indonesia on Friday. So the whole team.
Liem, how determined are these students? If the sections of the army, as you suggested yourself, do start shooting, will they go on?
These are very small sections of the army. And
but if
again,
they could do a lot of killing, if they do that, are the students determined enough to go on?
I think so, yeah. One of the students, one of the spokespersons said, Suharto came into power with a lot of blood. It's very possible that he will leave office with a lot of blood. So we expect nothing less than that.
All right.
So we are prepared for that.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Liem, Liong, Ahmad, Banerji, John Taylor, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Good evening. President Suharto of Indonesia is tonight clinging to power on the eve of the biggest protest yet against his regime. He said today he would go eventually, but he wouldn't say when. Millions of people are expected to take to the streets tomorrow after a week of riots and deaths. Today, thousands of protesters again besieged the parliament in Jakarta, calling for the president to be hanged. This report just in from our Asia correspondent, Mark Austin.
This evening, Jakarta is a city preparing for renewed turmoil. The army have warned student demonstrators to back off from massive protests planned for tomorrow. But today, in defiance, they completed their takeover of parliament, taking to the roof of the building where President Suharto has not been challenged for 30 years, and even to the corridors in their clamour for him to stand down. Like a man who knows the game is up, the beleaguered dictator prepared to speak to the nation from the presidential palace. He pledged immediate reforms, future elections, within 6 months, according to one minister, and most significant of all, he promised he wouldn't stand again. But it wasn't enough to satisfy his most bitter critics.
We want President Suharto to step down right now. We would like to have President Suharto, his family, and his cronies to be put on trial immediately.
Tell to your country, Suharto must die. Quite simply, for many of these students, President Suharto has not gone far enough. They remain skeptical that a man who's ruled this country with the iron grip of a dictator for more than 3 decades will suddenly relinquish power.
It's not only radical students taking to the streets. The army was called to the stock exchange today when brokers walked out in protest at the president's announcement. This evening, student leaders met and decided that despite President Suharto's concessions, tomorrow's protests would go on. The consequences can only be guessed at. Already the soldiers on the ground are nervous and uncertain. Never before have they been faced by 1 million or more of their own people determined to bring about change. Mark Austin, ITN, Jakarta.
The Foreign Office has confirmed that one Briton was killed in Indonesia. He's Neil Peacock, who was 35 and from Northumberland. The British ambassador in Indonesia today urged all Britons to leave there as soon as possible. ITN's Colin Baker reports from Jakarta.
The rush is on. It's time to go, say the Foreign Office. The President is still in power. And growing concern over what may happen tomorrow here in Jakarta means the British Embassy is now advising all expatriate British citizens to get out of Indonesia tonight.
The escape from Indonesia almost brought the airport to a stop. 2 hours to pass through security, the same again to reach the check-in desks. Lost in the masses, 400 British citizens filling a British Airways jumbo bound for Kuala Lumpur. On the streets, President Suharto's considerable military escort took him to an unknown destination, past the British Embassy, while inside, Ambassador Robin Christopher was briefing the Foreign Office in London on the deteriorating situation. On the other end of the line, John Shepherd, Deputy Under-Secretary, whose notes of this conversation would soon be passed to the Foreign Secretary and then Downing Street.
Tomorrow could be quite difficult. I'm worried on 2 fronts. I'm worried about the size of the student demonstration. However well-intentioned and peaceful the students may be, 1 million people, which is what they're talking about, possibly descending on Jakarta, is a lot of people to cope with.
We're advising British citizens that they should now leave Indonesia as soon as possible.
On the embassy's first floor, offices have been converted to emergency rooms to warn expatriates of the possible dangers ahead.
Mark it down and give us a lick.
John Robinson and his 13-year-old son Greg said goodbye to Socks, their puppy, this morning as they left for London. Their journey past the burnt-out buildings, past the tanks and armour on the streets, creating in them, like most of those leaving, uncertainty about what they'll find if they ever return. The last British evacuation flight has now gone, but there are at this airport thousands of many other nationalities trying to get out of Jakarta, trying to find a plane that's going anywhere. Colin Baker, ITN, Jakarta.
The yes vote in the Northern Ireland, they allowed it.
It was an extraordinary slap in the face for a regime that never permitted dissent. Every revolution has its defining venue, and Indonesia's could turn out to be a parliament engulfed by demonstrators. Inside, they were glued to the screens. Watching the dictator's first public response to the crisis, they thought he had given in. But then his real message, "I'll go," he said, "but not now." Sounding more like an uncle than an autocrat, he promised reforms and free elections as soon as possible. The alternative, he mused, was civil war. At the parliament, his threats didn't convince, and nor did his promises.
He's not answering us. He's not listening to us. He tried to blind himself, by changing the subject and turning the point upside down.
What President Suharto has shown with his speech this morning is that he still remains completely out of touch with his own people and their demands. The students here have not been satisfied by weasel-worded promises of resignation sometime in the future. They want him to go now.
Whatever the outcome of this revolution, most foreigners and ethnic Chinese don't want to see it. The threat of a bloodbath tomorrow has forced thousands to head to the departure lounge from hell.
Okay, well, as soon as they get
Making sure the last British expatriates get out, Claire Hatton from British Airways, surviving on 2 hours sleep a night and on superhuman patience.
The embassy are telling you to go now.
Right.
If you make that decision to stay, then you're on your own.
Is there a sense of panic amongst people who are trying to get out?
Yes, it certainly is now. Certainly is now.
Panic?
Panic, yes, panic. They want to get on any flight out of here.
Indonesia. Wish you weren't here. Matt Fry, BBC News, Jakarta.
Here, inflation.
2,000 people escaped from the country's capital, Jakarta. Claire Hatton kept her British Airways office open when other airlines had closed up. Tonight, her parents and fiancé said they were proud of her, but increasingly concerned for her safety.
At her home in the Dorset village of Gussage St Michael, Claire Hatton's mother Helen scans the newspapers for developments in Indonesia. Her daughter's been in the thick of the troubles there, and now she's found herself in the thick of the headlines too.
We've felt all along she's just doing her job, We didn't feel that, obviously we're proud of her, but we didn't think that she's going to be on front page of all the newspapers.
Claire's been hailed as a heroine for keeping the British Airways office she manages in Jakarta open for business, despite the anarchy breaking out on the streets around. Other airline offices had closed up, but Claire worked round the clock to help the exodus.
It's pandemonium in the airport at the moment. There are people all over the place. The city itself is okay. There is a build-up of students at the Parliament building, and there is a lot of armed forces present. It's actually my team who've done a fabulous job here. I'm just here as the BA representative, and we're just doing what we normally do.
Claire's family may be proud of her, but with at least one Briton now confirmed as having been killed amid the rioting and looting, they're anxious to have her home.
We're very worried now, but I'm quite sure that British Airways will keep her safe. They've now taken her from the main office in the centre to the airport, and she'll be much safer there. And they're setting the office up at the airport.
Claire's fiancé, who's
terms of his retreat from power. President Suharto says he will resign, but only after elections. It's not clear exactly when. Effectively, he's hanging on. Good evening. It's 1 o'clock tomorrow morning in Indonesia on a day that promises the biggest manifestation of people power yet. At least 1 million are expected. So far, the security forces have held back, but reports are they will move to try to stop it with force. Tonight, we report from Indonesia on the consolidating revolt of the people. Also tonight, politicians and pop. A live concert take to the streets of Indonesia in the next few hours for an unprecedented show of opposition to President Suharto. One prominent opposition leader, Amien Rais, has called for people's power to demand his immediate resignation, despite the president's pledge to stand down by the end of the year and hold elections within 6 months. One of the two Britons believed to be amongst the 500 people who have died in the unrest sweeping the country has been named as Neil Peacock, aged 35, from Northumberland. Our Asia correspondent Ian Williams reports now from the capital, Jakarta, on the mounting opposition to the president's proposals, fuelled by the suspicion that he's simply playing for time.
Again, their target was Parliament, a jubilant convoy of protest. Yesterday, they'd come in their hundreds. This morning, there were thousands of students from across Jakarta. They spilled onto the grounds of Parliament. In a marked contrast to yesterday, those few soldiers present carried no guns. So the students armed them with flowers, a gesture that received a warm response. By mid-morning, the grounds and rooftops of Parliament, even its cavernous halls, they all resounded to demands for Suharto to go. And the president appeared to be contemplating just that. On national television, he looked dejected as he prepared to address the nation. But in a confident statement, he said he would begin reforms and hold fresh elections in which he would not be a candidate. He appeared to be ready to stand down. Among the students at Parliament, the initial reaction was one of euphoria.
There is tremendous jubilation here, but also suspicion. They know President Suharto is a masterful tactician, and many will only believe he's really going when they see it for themselves.
And euphoria quickly turned to anger. Word spread that Suharto's statement lacked detail. There was no timetable for elections, and for the time being, he was clinging to power.
Suharto must die. Tell to your country, Suharto must die.
We want Suharto, his family, his cronies to be put on trial right now. And we want a stop to all forms of state violence.
Student leaders met and called for Suharto's immediate resignation. The protests and occupation of Parliament will continue. How long will you stay here for?
Until the House of Representatives told us when they're gonna ask Suharto step down.
While the man who's emerged as Indonesia's most effective opposition leader accused Suharto of buying time and said massive demonstrations planned for tomorrow will go ahead.
Have come to a point of no return, and they will again and again and again stage the demonstrations daily if necessary until finally the old man goes forever.
The army, whose loyalty to that old man is crucial to his survival, was patrolling the streets again today. They've warned ominously of possible unrest and bloodshed tomorrow. And it's with this in mind that the British Embassy today issued an urgent warning for all remaining British citizens to leave the country as soon as possible. Coaches were laid on to take them to the airport, where a chartered jumbo jet was being arranged tonight to evacuate them. 2 Britons have so far been killed by robbers during this crisis. This evening, the students remain in control of Parliament, unimpressed by new government assurances that Suharto will be gone by the end of the year. The protests have a momentum of their own, and in an atmosphere of suspicion and fear, the crisis looks more dangerous